They say silence speaks louder than words. But when I was crying, shaking, bleeding, and my husband stood still just 10 feet away, saying nothing, his silence shattered me more than any bruise ever could. My name is Carol Clark. I'm 79 years old now, living alone in a small 2-bedroom cottage just outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. If you passed by, you might catch me pruning my lavender bushes or humming old gospel songs on the porch swing. You'd never guess what I've been through. I wear peace on the outside, but deep inside, I carry the echoes of betrayal that shaped the rest of my life. I met Raymond Clark when I was just 21. It was the fall of 1967, and I was working as a receptionist at a local doctor's office. Raymond came in with a sprained wrist. He was a stocky, soft-spoken veteran, recently back from Vietnam. I offered him an ice pack and a smile, and he offered me dinner the very next weekend. Within a year, I was his wife. Our early days were warm and simple. Raymond worked long shifts at the supply warehouse, and I stayed home, volunteering at the church and cooking every meal from scratch. He wasn't the romantic type, but he was kind, steady, and I thought that was all I ever needed. We bought our house on the southern edge of town, a modest white clapboard home with creaky floors and a porch that wrapped around like a hug. I loved that house. I poured my heart into decorating it, floral curtains in the kitchen, hand-stitched quilts on the beds, a little bird feeder outside the window. I was proud of the life we were building. Then, Dennis arrived. Dennis Clark was Raymond's older brother by 5 years. He'd been through 2 divorces, bounced between jobs, and always seemed to bring bad weather with him. Raymond told me Dennis just needed a little help getting back on his feet. I wanted to trust my husband's judgment, so I nodded. We cleared out the guest room. Dennis moved in. From the start, something felt off. He was loud, drank too much, and had this way of watching me like I was something he could claim if he wanted. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe he didn't mean anything by the way he'd accidentally walk into the kitchen when I was changing laundry, or the way his eyes lingered too long when I bent over to pull a pie from the oven. I mentioned it once to Raymond. "He's just rough around the edges," Raymond said, brushing me off as he folded his work shirt. "He's been through a lot. Try not to be so sensitive. Carol." That moment, it seemed so small in hindsight, but it was the first time I felt truly alone in my own home. The days passed, and Dennis stayed. Weeks turned into months. He picked up odd jobs at a local auto shop but never really held steady work. And every time Raymond wasn't around, Dennis seemed to find a reason to be close to me, uncomfortably close. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our bedroom door. I froze. Raymond was snoring beside me, completely unaware. When I opened the door, there was Dennis, shirtless, pretending to look for the bathroom, despite having lived with us for over 3 months. I shut the door in his face and locked it. I told Raymond again. This time, I was shaking. "He's not just weird," I said. "He's watching me, waiting." Raymond just sighed. "He's family. Carol, family." That one word kept me prisoner longer than I ever imagined. Still, I tried to carry on setting the table every evening, attending Sunday service, hosting church ladies for lemonade on the porch. No one knew the tension I carried in my shoulders, the dread that wrapped itself around my spine every time Dennis was near. Looking back now, I can see how the silence started chipping away at me long before the worst happened. Raymond's silence, my own silence. The silence of neighbors who saw bruises I couldn't explain. It was a quiet storm, a slow drowning. I didn't know it then, but the day that storm broke would change everything. And it started with a knock on the bathroom door, one that came when I was most vulnerable. And when my husband just stood there, that moment is burned into me forever. And it's the moment I'll tell you about next. Before the silence, before the bruises, before the shame I wore like an invisible shawl, there was love. At least, I believe there was. When I think back to those early days with Raymond, I don't see the man who stood by and did nothing. I see the quiet young Marine who brought me daisies wrapped in newspaper, the man who blushed every time I looked at him too long, the one who called my father sir and waited nervously in our living room while my mother grilled him about his intentions. I was 21 and had never been kissed by a man I truly wanted. Raymond changed that. We met at the Gettysburg Harvest Festival in October of 1967. He was helping his church's food booth, ladling hot apple cider into styrofoam cups. I was walking with my friend Bonnie, wrapped in a mustard yellow scarf I'd knitted myself. Raymond spilled cider on his boots when he looked up and saw me. Bonnie leaned over and whispered, "That boy just fell in love." 3 weeks later, we had our first real date, a movie at the Majestic Theater Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, followed by milkshakes at Ernie's Diner. He wasn't talkative, but I didn't mind. He listened, really listened. When I told him I dreamed of opening a flower shop someday, he said, "I think you'd be good at that. Carol, you have gentle hands. No one had ever noticed my hands before." By spring of '68, he'd given me a modest ring small diamond, thin band, but he saved for it by working extra shifts at the warehouse. We were married that June, under the elm trees behind my parents' church, with lemonade in glass jars and lemon cake instead of a big wedding cake. It was simple and honest, just like Raymond. After the honeymoon, a long weekend at a cabin near Lake Raystown, we settled into a rented one-bedroom apartment above a grocery store. The ceiling creaked every time someone walked by upstairs, and our heater whined in the winter like a sad ghost, but it was ours. We ate grilled cheese for dinner more times than I care to count, and Raymond would leave me little notes on the bathroom mirror, usually just "have a good day, darlin'," scribbled in his blocky handwriting. He worked long hours, sometimes back-to-back shifts. I started volunteering with the ladies' circle at the Methodist Church, delivering meals to shut-ins, and reading aloud at the local library. It was a quiet life, but we were building something, or so I believed. In 1971, we bought our first and only home, a white clapboard house just south of town. It had a sloped tin roof and a screened-in porch that looked out onto a narrow stretch of woods. I remember crying when we signed the papers, overwhelmed that we had something to call our own. Raymond planted a cherry tree in the backyard that first spring. I planted tulips. We never had children, something I wanted deeply. But after 3 miscarriages, we stopped trying. I blamed my body. Raymond never spoke much about it, just held me when I cried and said, "Maybe it's just meant to be you and me, Carol." That was enough for a while. By the time we reached our 40s, our days had taken on a quiet rhythm. Raymond was dependable, if not particularly affectionate. He had his chair, his nightly newspaper, his coffee with exactly 1 sugar cube. We rarely argued. We rarely did anything bold, really. But there was comfort in the steadiness of it all. I knew when he would walk in the door. I knew how he liked his sandwiches. I knew the scent of his aftershave better than my own perfume. And then Dennis arrived, like a stone thrown into still water. Raymond told me about his brother's troubles one evening in the kitchen while I was peeling carrots. Dennis had lost his job at a body shop in Pittsburgh, gone through another divorce, and was living out of his pickup truck. just until he finds a place. Raymond said, he needs family right now. I looked at my husband, this man I had shared half my life with, and I saw the pleading in his eyes. He needed this, not just for Dennis, but for himself. Guilt, maybe, or loyalty. I couldn't tell. I said yes, because that's what I always did. I was a Clark, after all. Dennis moved in the next Saturday. He smelled like motor oil and stale tobacco, carried his life in a dented duffel bag and a box full of mismatched tools. He slapped Raymond on the back, winked at me, and said, "Now this is a sweet setup. You sure know how to pick 'em, little brother." I forced a smile, but something cold slid through my chest. He was older, taller, and louder than Raymond. He drank beer straight from the bottle and left his socks on the coffee table. But worse than all that was the way he looked at me like I was something fragile and his to break. Still, I told myself it was temporary. Still, I cooked dinner for 3 and set the table without complaint. Still, I kissed Raymond goodnight and thanked God for the quiet man I loved. But quiet, I would learn, can be dangerous too. And soon, that silence would become my cage. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just discomfort, nothing more than the strain of adjusting to someone new in the house. Dennis was, after all, Raymond's brother, and I'd always been taught that family was to be respected, even when they made you uneasy. But that feeling in my gut, that churning, tightening feeling, every time Dennis walked into a room, I couldn't ignore it for long. He had a way of showing up when I least expected it. I'd be folding laundry in the back room, humming to myself, and suddenly I'd hear his boots behind me. No knock, no, hey, Carol, just the squeak of the floorboards and his breath at my shoulder. "You always smell like vanilla," he said once, standing far too close. "Bet you taste just as sweet." I froze. I turned, holding a folded towel in my hands like a shield, and forced a laugh. "You're full of it, Dennis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He smirked. "That's what they tell me." That night, I told Raymond about it. We were sitting in bed. He was flipping through the sports section, and I was rubbing lotion into my hands. I told him what Dennis said, how close he stood. Raymond didn't look up. He jokes around too much. I know, but he doesn't mean anything by it. He's just rough. Ray. It made me uncomfortable. He sighed and finally looked at me. He's got nowhere else to go. "Carol, just let's give it time." "Okay." I nodded, but something in me tightened. It was the first time I felt like Raymond chose Dennis over me. The first time I realized my comfort had a limit, one that stopped where his brother's needs began. Dennis kept pushing boundaries, slowly, deliberately. He'd walk into the bathroom without knocking when I was brushing my teeth. "Sorry," he'd say with a smirk, but he never really looked sorry. When I'd be bent over the oven pulling out a casserole, I'd feel his eyes on me. One time he even let out a low whistle. Raymond was always conveniently out of the room, at work, in the garage, mowing the lawn, always gone when I needed him to see. There were small things, too, like how Dennis began calling me darlin' in a voice that dripped with something rotten. Or how he'd lean in too close to pour himself coffee, brushing against me as if by accident. Once or twice, he left his laundry with no underclothes just to force me to say something. I suspect I never touched it. I started dreading being alone in the house. Every time Raymond worked a late shift, I made sure every door was locked. I kept a chair jammed under the guest room doorknob. I took showers with the bathroom door bolted tight, towel already hung within arm's reach. It was exhausting. this constant sense of alertness, like living in a haunted house with a ghost you couldn't prove was there. I stopped wearing dresses. I switched to long-sleeved blouses and slacks. Even in the heat of July, I pretended it was just my age, that I was growing modest. But deep down, I knew I was trying to disappear. Dennis noticed, shame to hide a body like that. He said one morning over scrambled eggs, "Raymond doesn't mind it. Why should you?" I flinched. Raymond was right there. He set down his fork, looked at Dennis, then looked away. That silence. It settled over the table like a fog. Dennis kept grinning, as if it were some game only he understood. I stared down at my plate, suddenly unable to eat. Later that day, I asked Raymond why he didn't say something. I did. He said, "No, Ray, you didn't." You looked at him and then looked away. "What do you want me to do?" "Carol, kick him out. He's my brother. I want you to defend me." He didn't answer. The next week, Dennis brought home a six-pack and sat on the porch until nearly midnight. I watched from the window as he drank one after another, lighting cigarette after cigarette and staring out into the trees. He looked like a man stewing in his own darkness, and I realized maybe he was. Maybe whatever had gone wrong in his life had hardened him into someone who found power in making others small. And somehow, I had become his favorite target. I began keeping a small notepad in my dresser. I wrote down every incident date, time, what was said or done. It felt silly at first, like I was keeping secrets from my own husband. But something in me whispered, "You may need this someday." I also started writing letters I never sent. Pages and pages addressed to Raymond, to Dennis, even to myself. I poured my fear into those letters, my anger, my guilt, my heartbreak. They were hidden beneath my sweaters, folded neatly in a shoebox labeled winter scarves. Looking back, I think that was the beginning of me trying to claw my way out. Not physically, not yet, but mentally, emotionally. I was preparing to break the silence, if not for the world, then at least for me. And I didn't know it then, but that moment would come sooner than I expected. One night, one locked door, one scream, and the person who heard it chose to walk away. It happened on a Wednesday night. Raymond had taken an evening shift at the warehouse, something about covering for a younger guy with a newborn. I'd made chicken pot pie for dinner, the way Raymond liked it, with extra thyme and a flaky crust. Dennis barely touched it. He just drank 2 beers and said he was going to tinker around in the garage. I washed the dishes slowly, one by one, as if I could delay the night from moving forward. The house was too quiet without Raymond's footsteps upstairs, his familiar humming after dinner. I dried my hands, checked that the back door was locked, and headed upstairs for a warm shower. I'd barely finished rinsing the conditioner from my hair when I heard it. A knock, sharp, heavy, right on the bathroom door. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it echoing in my ears. "Carol," Dennis's voice called through the door, muffled but unmistakably close. "You in there?" I didn't answer. I wrapped the towel around my body and pressed my back to the cold tile wall. The doorknob jiggled. "Door's stuck," he said. "Need me to help?" My voice was tight, barely above a whisper. "No, I'm fine. I'm coming out in a minute." There was silence. Then a laugh, low, ugly. "You always so jumpy." "Sweetheart," I didn't respond. I waited. I counted slowly to 30 before I cracked open the door. The hallway was empty. I walked quickly to the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, shaking. I told myself I was imagining things, that he was drunk, that maybe he really thought something was wrong with the door. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. The next day, I told Raymond what had happened. He rubbed his temples like I was giving him a headache. He was probably just being stupid. You know how Dennis is. No, Ray, I don't think you know how Dennis is. He looked up. You think he meant to scare you. I think he knew I was naked in that bathroom and wanted to be near it. I think he was trying to come in. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window. He's my brother. Carol, I stood too, and I'm your wife. He turned around slowly. He's had a hard life. Okay, divorce. No kids. He drinks too much. But I don't think he'd do anything like that. Then you're not paying attention. Raymond didn't respond. He just sat back down, opened the newspaper, and buried himself in the sports section like nothing had happened. That silence had hit harder than a slap. In the days that followed, I kept my distance from Dennis as much as I could. I stayed out of rooms if I heard him inside. I took longer trips to the grocery store. I spent hours pruning the garden, even in the rain. Anything to avoid being alone with him, but avoidance only works for so long. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything changed. Raymond had taken a nap on the living room recliner after church. I just folded laundry in the back room and was heading down the hall when Dennis stepped out of the shadows. I gasped. He stood in my path, arms folded, smirking like he'd been waiting for me. "You been avoiding me, sweetheart?" I took a step back. "Excuse me, Dennis, I need to get by." He didn't move. "What's wrong? You act like I'm some kind of monster. I don't feel safe around you." That wiped the smile off his face. "What did you say?" His tone darkened. "I said I don't feel safe." He leaned in. "You think I'd hurt you? Huh, little Miss Perfect Carol Clark." His hand reached out too fast. He grabbed my arm and yanked me toward him. I stumbled, hitting the wall behind us. "Let go of me," I screamed. And that's when Raymond appeared. He stood at the end of the hall, eyes wide, frozen. He saw it, my towel slipping off my shoulder, Dennis's hand gripping my wrist. He saw my face twisted in fear. "Raymond," I shouted, my voice cracking, and he did nothing. He didn't rush forward. He didn't yell. He didn't move. He just stared at us like we were a scene on TV, something far away. Unreal. Not his to intervene in. Dennis slowly let go of me, chuckling. "She's got a temper. This one." Raymond still didn't speak. I pushed past Dennis, ran to the bedroom, and slammed the door behind me. I locked it and collapsed to the floor, sobbing, not just from fear, but from the sharp, undeniable realization that I was alone, that the man I had trusted for nearly 4 decades had chosen silence over action, that his loyalty to his brother was louder than his love for me. Later that night, Raymond knocked on the bedroom door. "Carol, you okay?" I didn't answer. "Do you want to talk?" Still, I said nothing. After a while, I heard him walk away. I laid on the bed, staring at the ceiling. My body ached where Dennis had grabbed me, but deeper than that was the ache in my heart, this gaping wound carved open by betrayal. I thought about packing my bags right then, about calling Linda and asking her to come get me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by shame, by fear, by disbelief. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I wrote another letter, not to Dennis, not even to Raymond. This one was to myself. "Dear Carol, you are not crazy. You are not making things up. You are not weak. What happened today was real, and it was not your fault. I folded it and placed it in the shoebox with the others. It was the first time I truly saw the bars of the cage I was living in, and it was the first time I promised myself someday I would break free. After that day, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap I couldn't escape. Dennis had crossed a line, and Raymond had watched him do it, and yet nothing changed. There were no arguments, no confrontations, no apologies, just silence, a heavy, nauseating silence that settled into every room like dampness after a storm. It was as if Raymond had tucked the whole incident away into some corner of his mind, labeled too complicated, and chosen never to revisit it. I went about my routines with a hollow heart, cooking, cleaning, weeding the garden, but everything I did felt like it was happening from far away, like I was watching another woman go through the motions while I stood somewhere behind her, screaming, "Dennis!" Of course, didn't stop. If anything, he got bolder. He knew now that Raymond wouldn't intervene, that I had no real protection. One evening, I was setting the table for dinner when Dennis came up behind me, brushed his hand against my hip, and whispered, "You still look good in those slacks, sweetheart." I jerked away and dropped a fork. It clanged on the hardwood floor. Raymond looked up from his recliner, saw the scene me frozen. Dennis, smirking, and then, once again, turned back to the television. I wanted to scream, shake him, demand, "Why are you letting this happen?" But I didn't, because a part of me already knew the answer. Raymond wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel. He was just weak. And that weakness, that unwillingness to stand between me and harm, had become just as dangerous as Dennis's aggression. I began to retreat. I started sleeping in the guest room under the pretense of back pain. I changed my shower schedule to early mornings, when Raymond was still home and Dennis was asleep. I stopped volunteering at church, not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't bear the lies I had to tell when people asked how things were going. "You and Raymond still going strong after all these years?" "Oh, we're doing just fine," I'd say with a forced smile, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles went white. At night, I sat by the window and watched the stars. I remembered how I used to pray as a girl, whispering hopes into the dark, believing someone out there was listening. But now, all I could whisper was, "Please, let me feel safe again." The worst part wasn't the fear. It wasn't even the shame. It was the isolation. I had no one. Not really. My parents were long gone. Raymond's family had always been distant, and mine had scattered over the years. My closest friend, Linda, lived nearly an hour away in York, and I hadn't seen her in over a year. I didn't want to burden her with my pain, and truthfully, I didn't think she'd believe me, because from the outside, Raymond and I looked like the perfect couple. 40 years married, no scandals, no drama, just the quiet, respectable Clark family in the White House near the woods. But inside these walls, I was shrinking. Some nights, I wrote in my notebook until my hand cramped. Not just what Dennis had said or done, but how it made me feel. How betrayed I felt by Raymond. How the silence in the hallway that day, when I'd screamed and he'd done nothing, echoed louder than anything Dennis had ever said. I read books on emotional abuse, on trauma. I watched old black and white movies just to lose myself in someone else's life for a while. I started sleeping with the closet light on. And still, I stayed. Why? Because I was scared. Scared of starting over at my age. Scared of people judging me. Scared of walking away from the life I had built, even if that life had begun to rot from the inside out. One morning, I woke up with a bruise on my wrist shaped like a thumb. I stared at it in the mirror, touched it gently, and felt something stir inside me. Anger. Real. Burning anger. Not just at Dennis, but at myself. For letting it go on this long. For believing I had no options. For thinking silence was safer than truth. That was the morning I called Linda. I didn't even know what I was going to say. My hand shook as I dialed her number. My voice caught in my throat as she answered. "Carol," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" And I broke. The tears came before the words. Ugly, gasping sobs that poured from somewhere deep in my chest. I told her everything. Dennis, the bathroom, the hallway, Raymond's silence. She didn't hesitate. "I'm coming," she said. "Today. You're not staying in that house one more night." "No, Linda," I whispered. "I'm not ready. I don't know how to leave." There was a pause. Then she said something that changed everything. "You don't have to know how. You just have to want to. I'll help you with the rest." And for the first time in months, I felt something shift. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, glowing faintly like a match in the dark. That day, I opened the shoebox full of letters and notes I had written over the past months. I reread each one, every hurt, every fear, every unspoken scream. Then I picked up a fresh page and wrote a new sentence: "I will leave this house, and I will never come back." It wasn't a plan. Not yet. But it was a promise. And this time, I meant it. The following Sunday, Linda pulled up to my house in her old blue Buick, just as the church bells in town were ringing noon. I'd told Raymond I wasn't feeling well and stayed home from service. Dennis had gone off with some buddies to a bar just outside of town. It was the first time in weeks I had the house to myself. When I opened the door and saw Linda's face, I nearly collapsed into her arms. She held me tightly, her hands warm against my back, and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so many meals had been served in silence. I poured us both coffee, though neither of us touched it. I told her everything, this time without hesitation, how Dennis had watched me, touched me, followed me, how he had crossed the line, and how Raymond just let it happen. Linda didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, nodding slowly, her hand resting over mine. When I was done, she looked me square in the eye. "You have to get out. Carol, you know that, right?" I nodded. "I know. I've known for a while. I took a shaky breath. I don't know how." She leaned back in her chair. "You don't need to figure it all out today, but we're going to take the first step now." She reached into her purse and pulled out a brochure. It was from a women's advocacy center in Harrisburg, 2 hours away. They had housing, legal help, counseling. She'd already called them. They had space. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling. "I don't want to be a burden." "Carol," she said firmly, "you are not a burden. You are someone who has been hurt, and you deserve safety, peace, and the right to live without fear." That night, after Raymond and Dennis were asleep, I tiptoed into the hall closet and pulled down a small suitcase. Quietly, carefully, I began to pack. Only the essentials: a few changes of clothes, my notebook of letters, a framed picture of my parents, and the small wooden cross my mother had given me on my wedding day. I hid the suitcase in the bottom of the linen chest, beneath old blankets no one had touched in years. Every day after that, Linda and I talked by phone, using a schedule we worked out mid-mornings, while Dennis was out, and Raymond was usually working in the garage. She gave me a list of what to prepare: personal documents, birth certificate, social security card, driver's license, bank records and account numbers, prescription medications, copies of Raymond's paycheck stubs, and utility bills for proof of residence. I worked slowly, methodically, hiding paperwork between recipe books, slipping cash into my bra when I went to the grocery store, and asking for cash back. Over 2 weeks. I quietly collected almost $400, just enough to get me started if things didn't go as planned. I didn't tell Raymond. As much as I wanted to give him one more chance to look me in the eye and choose me over his brother, I knew better now. I'd done that already. I'd cried in front of him, pleaded, and he had looked away. Sometimes love isn't loud, but neither is betrayal. And Raymond's betrayal had been deafening in its silence. One afternoon, I sat on the porch alone while Dennis was gone, holding my mother's cross in my hands. I stared out at the backyard where Raymond had planted that cherry tree all those years ago. Its branches were bare now, stripped by time and season. A single bird perched on the topmost limb, shivering against the wind. I wondered if it was waiting, like me, for a time to fly. That same evening, Dennis stumbled home reeking of whiskey. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter. When he came in, he leaned in too close. "Heard you've been awful quiet lately. Carol, don't tell me you're going cold on me." I didn't flinch. I turned slowly, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm not yours, Dennis." And I never was. He blinked, surprised, then smirked. "You got fire now, huh?" I didn't answer. I left the room with my chin held high, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. The next day, I called Linda and told her I was ready. We made the plan. She'd pick me up that Saturday morning, just after 7 a.m., while Dennis was out for his usual greasy breakfast at the diner, and Raymond would still be snoring in bed. I'd leave a note, nothing dramatic, just the truth, that I was leaving, that I had been hurt, that I was choosing myself for the first time in my life. Friday night. I packed the last of my things. The shoebox of letters went in first. I placed my wedding ring on top, though it felt heavier than anything else I carried. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid in bed listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house settling in the cold. I wondered if they'd notice I was gone right away, if they'd care, if Raymond would be angry, or if he'd finally, quietly, understand. I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. As the first light of morning poured through the window, I slipped on my coat, grabbed the suitcase, and stepped outside. Linda was already waiting in the driveway, the Buick humming softly. I didn't look back, not at the cherry tree, not at the porch swing, not at the house that once held my dreams and then became my prison. As we drove away, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not fear, not guilt, but freedom. And though I didn't know exactly where the road would lead, I knew I'd never again let someone else's silence drown my voice. The road to Harrisburg was quiet that morning. Linda didn't speak much, and neither did I, but her presence beside me felt like an anchor, steady, reassuring. I stared out the window at the trees rushing by, their bare branches slicing across the soft gray sky like veins. I had dreamed of this drive for months, maybe years, and now I was really doing it, leaving everything behind. When we pulled up to the Women's Advocacy Center, I hesitated. The building was a plain brick structure with a white sign and narrow windows. It didn't look like much from the outside, but inside It held something I hadn't known in a long time: safety. Maggie Turner, the intake coordinator, greeted us at the door. She looked to be in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Carol," she said gently, "we've been expecting you." That first night, I slept in a shared room with 2 other women, both much younger than me. One was barely in her 20s with a black eye and a toddler who clung to her pant leg. The other was a middle-aged nurse who spoke only in whispers. We didn't trade stories, not right away, but we shared something stronger than words: survival. I didn't cry that night. I thought I would. I thought I'd crumble the second my head hit the pillow, but I didn't. I laid awake staring at the ceiling, breathing in the silence, not the heavy, suffocating kind I'd known for years, but a clean, peaceful silence. It felt like oxygen. Over the following weeks, I met with a counselor, a quiet woman named Judy, with graying curls and a soft Southern accent. She let me take my time. I told her things I hadn't even written in my letters, about the way Raymond had changed, about the way I had changed, about how sometimes the deepest wounds aren't left by fists, but by people who refuse to lift a hand at all. I also began attending weekly support groups. At first, I felt out of place. Most of the women were young, some barely out of high school. I was 78 then, wrinkled, gray-haired, and unsure of where I fit. But one afternoon, a woman with silver braids and tired eyes looked at me and said, "You give me hope. If you can walk away after all those years, maybe I can too." I broke down then. Not from sadness, but from something else. Recognition. In time. I moved into a small room at a transitional housing unit run by the center. It was modest: a twin bed, a dresser, a small desk, but it was mine. I hung lace curtains in the window and bought a tiny plant from a flea market. I began volunteering at a nearby senior center, helping organize books and plan small garden projects. The work gave me purpose. The routine gave me peace. And the people gave me something I hadn't had in years: connection. I stayed in touch with Linda. She called every Sunday, always asking the same question first: "How's your heart today?" It made me smile, because some days my heart felt lighter. Other days it still carried too much, but it was healing. Slowly, gently. One afternoon, while sorting donated clothing at the center, I found a scarf mustard yellow, the same shade I wore the day I met Raymond at the Harvest Festival all those decades ago. I held it against my chest and closed my eyes. I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered, "Thank you, Carol, for finally choosing you." That evening, I wrote a new letter this time, not about the pain, but about the woman I was becoming, about the strength I had uncovered, about the quiet power of beginning again. I am not a victim. I wrote, I am not what they did to me. I am not the silence I endured. I am Carol Clark, and I am free. From then on, I no longer called it running away. I called it returning to myself. I never expected to find meaning in the middle of rebuilding a life so long buried beneath fear, but somehow it found me. 3 months after moving into the transitional unit, I began leading journaling workshops at the Women's Center every Tuesday afternoon. It started small, just a few ladies and a stack of blank notebooks, but it quickly became one of the most healing spaces I'd ever known. We wrote letters to our past selves, to our abusers, to the women we hoped to become. One Tuesday, after the group had packed up, a young woman named Tanya lingered behind. She was no older than 30, her arms thin, her voice quieter than wind. She touched my elbow gently and said, "Miss Carol, when you talk, I believe I can survive too." That night, I wept not out of sadness, but gratitude that something good was rising from all the brokenness. It was around that time that Maggie, the center's director, asked if I'd be willing to speak at a local survivors conference in Lancaster. It would mean a lot, she said, especially coming from someone your age. I hesitated at first. The thought of standing on a stage, saying those words aloud in front of strangers, made my chest tighten. But a voice deep inside, stronger now than it had ever been, nudged me forward. "I'll do it," I said, "but I won't sugarcoat a thing." She smiled. "That's exactly why we need you." The day of the event, I wore a blue scarf Linda had knitted me and pinned my mother's cross near my collarbone. The auditorium was modest, maybe 70 people, but it felt like the whole world was watching when I stepped up to the microphone. I began simply, "My name is Carol Clark. I am 79 years old, and I am a survivor." I told them everything, not just what Dennis had done, but what Raymond hadn't. How silence can be just as violent as the act itself. How I stayed for decades, not because I was weak, but because I believed I had no right to more. And how, one day, I realized choosing myself wasn't selfish, it was sacred. When I stepped off that stage, there were tears in the eyes of people I'd never met. I thought I'd feel exposed, vulnerable, but instead I felt strong, clear, unafraid. After the event, a woman approached me with a hesitant smile. "My name's Cheryl Adams," she said. "Dennis Clark is my cousin." My breath caught. I hadn't heard that name aloud in months. It still sent a chill through me. She continued, her voice gentle. "I always had a feeling something was off with him, but I never knew. And now, hearing what he did to you, I'm so sorry." I shook my head. "You have nothing to apologize for." But Cheryl didn't stop there. She leaned in and said, "He did something awful to another woman years ago. She told me about it once, but she was too afraid to go to the police. If you ever want to pursue charges, I'll help you." I didn't say anything right away, because for so long, I thought that chapter of my life was closed, that justice was something only young people pursued, that at my age, I should settle for peace, not fight for accountability. But Cheryl's offer stayed with me. And a few weeks later, I walked into a legal aid office in Harrisburg and told my story once more, this time not for healing, but for action. With the support of the center and the witness statements Cheryl helped provide, we reopened an old police report involving Dennis from the early 2000s. Though too much time had passed for my own case to go to trial, the other case moved forward. I sat in the back of the courtroom the day Dennis was arraigned for sexual assault. He looked older, grayer, but still carried that same arrogance in his eyes. Until he saw me, I didn't look away. I didn't shrink. I held my ground, like the woman I had become, not the woman he once tried to break. As they led him away in handcuffs, a strange calm settled over me. Not joy, not revenge, just release. That night, I wrote one last letter. To the woman I was when I met him, you didn't deserve what happened. To the woman I was when I stayed, you were braver than you knew. And to the woman I am now, you are free. Keep going. And I did. By the time I turned 79, I had begun living a life I never imagined I'd have, not because it was grand or flashy, but because it was mine, truly mine. No one followed me down hallways anymore. No one touched me without permission. No one silenced my voice or dismissed my fears. I woke up each morning in a small apartment overlooking a park in Harrisburg. The space was quiet, sunlit, filled with small things that brought me joy: a ceramic vase from a flea market, framed letters from women I'd helped, a wind chime that clinked softly in the breeze outside my kitchen window. I got used to cooking just for myself. I found peace in the way soup simmered or how the smell of cinnamon clung to the walls when I baked. I'd sit on my porch with a cup of tea and watch the children playing in the park across the street. Sometimes I'd smile to myself, thinking, this is what safety feels like. Linda and I talked every week. She visited often, and each time she left, she hugged me tighter than before, as if silently saying, "You made it." One crisp afternoon in October, I was invited to speak at the senior center where I volunteered. Not just about my story, but about resilience, about starting over, even in the final chapters of life. I stood before a room full of older women and men, many with eyes like mine, tired but still searching. I lost nearly 40 years of myself. I told them, not to one man, but to silence, to shame, to believing I didn't deserve more. I saw heads nod. I saw tears. But you can reclaim what's left. I said, whether you're 60 or 80, whether you leave or stay, whether you speak or write or just sit still and say, I matter. Because you do. We all do. Afterward, a woman named Florence came up to me. Her hands were frail, her hair as white as snow, but her eyes were fierce. I waited too long, she whispered. I gently squeezed her hand. Then let's not waste another second. Sometimes, healing isn't a thunderstorm, it's a slow thaw. And slowly, I thawed. I found joy in small things, reading romance novels again, learning how to email my nieces in Oregon, planting lavender on my window ledge. I even adopted an old rescue cat named Mabel Grumpy and missing one ear, but loyal as a shadow. She slept on my chest every night, purring as if to remind me I wasn't alone. Every so often, the past crept in, a scent, a sound, a flash of memory I didn't ask for, but I didn't run from it anymore. I let it come, let it pass. I'd whisper to myself, you're safe now, Carol, and then go on living, because I had earned this life, not just survived to reach it, but fought, scraped, cried, and chose it. No one handed me peace. I built it, brick by fragile brick. This past spring, I turned 79 and held something like a celebration, not the kind with balloons or music, but a quiet gathering of women from the shelter, volunteers from the center, and of course, Linda. We sat under a tree in the park with picnic blankets and shared homemade pie. There was laughter, tears, and moments of silence that didn't feel heavy anymore, just full of meaning. At one point, Maggie stood up and said, Carol, you're the reason 3 women here found the courage to leave. You've changed lives. I looked around at those faces so different in age, background, pain, and I realized something I had never dared to believe. Maybe my story wasn't just a tragedy I carried. Maybe it had become a light. Later that evening, I walked home alone, wind brushing softly against my cheeks, and I paused outside my door. I looked up at the sky, faint stars just beginning to appear, and felt my chest rise with a fullness I hadn't known in decades. I had done something I once thought impossible. I had walked away from silence. I had rebuilt from ruins, and I had lived to tell the truth out loud, unashamed. For years, I believed I had to stay, that my age, my vows, my loyalty meant I owed everyone something, even if it cost me myself. But now I know you don't owe anyone your pain. You don't have to wait for permission to leave. You don't have to stay just because time has passed. You don't have to be young to begin again. And most of all, you are never too old to choose peace. If you're reading this and you've ever felt invisible in your own home, ever whispered your truth into a pillow because no one else would listen, ever told yourself that maybe this is just what life is now, please hear me. It isn't too late. You can still leave. You can still heal. You can still bloom, just like I did. And if no one else says it to you today, let me be the one. You matter. Your voice matters. Your life matters. I'm Carol Clark. I'm 79 years old, and this is the life I chose. Sometimes the people we love most hurt us the deepest, not with their fists, but with their silence, their inaction, their refusal to stand beside us when it counts. And when that happens, the bravest thing we can do is not to fight back, but to walk away with our dignity, our story, and our voice intact. You are never too old to rewrite your ending. You are never too broken to be whole again. And you are never, ever alone in your pain. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you or someone you love faced something similar? Your voice could help someone else feel seen. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience, healing, and hope, because sometimes the most extraordinary strength is found in the quiet courage of survivors like Carol. Thank you for listening.